Right, welcome year 10. This is your next poetry lesson. This is a lesson on Ozymandias. This poem's in your anthology, so if you've got your anthology, you can use this at home to make notes on. If you don't have your anthology, I'll put a link to where you can get the poem for free online. And you can make notes on this book, and you can transfer these to your anthology when you're at school. You can also contact the school and we can send you out an anthology if you really need one. You need 3 highlighters in different colours. You need a pen and paper to make notes, or your class book, or if you want to make notes on the computer, that's fine too. And you need a quiet place to work. It's going to be really helpful if you're able to sort of pause and rewind and look at the lesson over a period of time. The first, one of the most important things we need to do is look at the assessment objectives for the lesson. So there's 3 of them. The first one is just to read, understand and respond to text. So in that case, this is the poem. So to be able to read the poem, understand the sort of story behind it and be able to give your own opinions on that. AO2 is analyse language, form and structure and talk about the meaning and effects that creates on the reader. This one's really important. It says use subject terminology where appropriate. So this is words like metaphor, simile, when you're talking about the language. And it's really important that when you're using those words, and they are important, that you are linking them back to the meaning and the effect that they have on the reader. The last one is show understanding of the relationships between texts and the context in which they're written. So the first part of this lesson, we're going to look at some context about Shelley, the poet who wrote this poem. And when we're writing about it and when you're revising it, you need to try and connect the context of the things that have happened in his life to the important parts of the poem. I would like you to have a look at the link on this slide, which I'll also put in the Show My Homework post. This is called Cornell Notes. This is a really useful way to make notes that will help you revise. So you basically split your page into 3. The middle and the biggest bit is where you write your notes as you're learning. The bottom part is where you review your notes. And in the sidebar, you do a sort of synthesis, so you pick out the most important points. This is really useful because it means that you don't just take in the information, you're doing something with it straight away, which will hopefully mean that you can remember it better for exams later in the year. So context. So Shelley was born in 1792 and he lived till 1822. He was younger than some of the other Romantic poets, but obviously you can see from those dates that he didn't live to be very old. He did lots of his writing when he was very young. He was well educated. He went to Eton, which is a very nice, a very posh private school, but he was bullied there, and this caused him to retreat into his imagination when he went to university at Oxford. He was expelled from Oxford for expressing atheist views. So atheist views means that he didn't believe in God. He didn't believe there was any God at all. And this at the time would have been quite a rebellious point of view, and enough to get him expelled from the university. He had a difficult relationship with his parents. His father was a member of parliament, so his father had a very public face to keep up, and his rebellious son didn't really fit in with that face, so they had a difficult relationship with each other. He was quite unusually for the time vegetarian. He took part in political radicalism, so he was sort of fighting against the common thoughts of the day, and he believed in sexual freedom. So his parents rejected these ideas, which further added to their difficult relationship. He also had what we might say is a complicated love life. He had children with 2 different women, which was very unusual in those days. And one of those women, or the second of those women, was Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. He was also friends with Lord Byron and Keats, who wrote 2 other poems in our anthology. So Byron wrote She Walks in Beauty and Keats wrote Tautum. And he's considered to be one of the most influential Romantic poets. So these pictures should help us get an idea of what Shelley was writing about. Ozymandias was the name of an Egyptian pharaoh, and he was also called Ramesses II of Egypt. So a pharaoh has many different jobs. A pharaoh is a bit like a king, but he is also sort of considered a god on earth, head of the government, and leader of the army. So there's a lot of power there, sort of something that many different people might do these days, rather than just one person. But in the ancient Egyptians, there's one person that had this whole role. He ruled Egypt from his teens to his 90s. So he was one of the greatest pharaohs ever, and he had a number of statues built of him. And if you look at this one down the bottom, this is actually the statue that was brought to England from Egypt at the time that Shelley wrote this poem. So this is the actual statue that the poem is based upon. So as I say, context is really important. When you have these in your notes, when you are looking at the language, when we're looking at the poem, we need to try and make those contextual links and link it to the language in the poem and link it to what's happening in the poem. So the first thing to do is to read the poem as a whole and get a really try and get a grasp on what the poem is about, the story that the poet is trying to tell us. So, I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my work, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." So the general gist of this poem is that Shelley is telling it from a sort of second point of view. He's saying that he's heard this story from a traveller who's been to a foreign land, and he's talking about a broken statue that he saw in the desert. That's basically it. They're talking about the decay of the statue, and he wants you to think about how a statue represents power and authority, and when it's first up there, it's really sort of commandeering. Everyone would look up to it, and now it's nothing. Now it's just broken and lying in the desert. And he wants us to think about how power changes and how people aren't always as great as they start out to be at the beginning. So the way that this lesson is going to work now is I'm going to ask you, I'm going to go through the poem bit by bit. I'm going to ask you some questions. You then need to pause the video, answer the questions, and then when you press play, I'll explain my answers and you can put your answers together with those. So the first thing we need to do with every poem is look at the title of the poem. And I want to ask you two questions about this. So if the poem is named after one person, what does that suggest about the person? And then I want you to think about etymology. So etymology is when you break the word down into where it comes from. So the first part of this word, Ozy, comes from the Greek Ozyam, to breathe air, and Mandias comes from the Greek mandate, to rule. So what does this suggest about the ruler, about Ozymandias? That his name comes from the words air and rule. So pause the video now, write down any of your ideas, and then unpause to see what my answers were. So naming a person after a poem after one person suggests that they are powerful and important. There's no other part to this name. You know, it's just the person's name, so it gives you something. It gives you an idea of how important Ozymandias was. And the fact that his name comes from the words air and to rule, it suggests it's natural for him to rule, similar to the way that breathing is natural. It might seem that we are adding quite a lot of meaning to that, but if you think about the fact that the actual pharaoh's name was Ramesses, and he had this alternative name, Ozymandias, so it's important that Shelley's chosen this name to be the lead on his poem. So moving on now, and this is where we're going to, if you have the poem, we're going to annotate it. I have split my highlights into blue, yellow and pink. So blue for imagery, yellow for language, and pink for structure. I would suggest you do something similar. It doesn't have to be the same colours, but it will help you to split it into those 3 areas which you need to cover when you're revising your poems. So we have got 4 questions on this slide. I've highlighted the bits we're going to look at. So I'll read through the questions, explain them to you, and then we're going to pause the video and you're going to answer them before you move on to my answers. So the poem's persona only hears of Ozymandias by hearing someone else tell a story. What is the effect of framing the poem in this way, and what does it suggest about Ozymandias? So why does he tell it as like a secondhand story, basically? Then I want you to think about the word antique. So what's the effect of describing the land as antique? So that in that one, I want you to think about the connotations of the word antique. In this next quote, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone, I want you to tell me what you think this image suggests about Ozymandias. And the last image, shattered visage lies, I want you to do the same question, what does this image suggest about Ozymandias? So pause the video now, answer those questions, and then we'll move on to what my answers were. So in terms of the first question, what difference does it make that we hear this story as a sort of second-hand story? By framing the poem as a story, the sense of distance is created between the reader and Ozymandias, so it's sort of buried within a story. And it suggests that maybe he's not all that powerful and his fame and reputation is not that great. He's just heard as a story from a traveller. It's not in the news, it's not in the museums, it's not something that's really important there. The use of the word antique. So antique suggests something that's old, outdated and fragile. Shelley is suggesting that it's no longer relevant, showing that Ozymandias no longer has power. This is somewhere where we could sort of connect some context. We know that Shelley is quite revolutionary, we know that he's quite rebellious, and he's fighting against things in politics and in society that he would have considered old and outdated. So he would have been very much in favour of things that were maybe new and sort of things that he felt moved society on. And also the fact he doesn't really agree with religion either would suggest that he wants to sort of live in the present times, and that the way you would look at something that was old is that it's no use to society anymore. The 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone. So vast means big, like giant, and trunkless means that they didn't have a body. So it's just the legs that are in the picture there. So from that we can sort of have the idea that he was once powerful and sturdy from the word vast, but using the word trunkless gives us the impression that power has been taken away. So he's no longer powerful, he's no longer important. And then the last image that we have here, the shattered visage. So shattered means broken, and visage means face. So we've got this, it suggests that no one person, not even Ozymandias, has everlasting power, and that time and nature will eventually overpower man. So this idea about time and nature is because it's out in the desert, so it's this big vast area of nature, and it's sunk into the sand's taken over. Like, there's nothing important about this statue anymore. It's not the center of a town, it's not the center of anything. So that just shows us about how his power has disappeared. So moving on to our next bit here, I've got 3 questions for you here. I'll talk through the questions again, and then you pause, answer the questions, and then move on and look at what my answers were too. So the first question says, how has Shelley used language to create the impression that Ozymandias was unpleasant? Why might he have done this? So from this you can look at sort of any of the images that we've got here, and I want us to think about why was Shelley trying to make Ozymandias seem unpleasant, and how has he done that? The next one looks at the quote cold command, and my question is, what does the use of consonants emphasize? So consonants are any letters that aren't A, E, I, or U, O or U, and is that k sound. So does that give you any sort of images in your mind? Does that sort of help us think about something? What effect does the sort of repetition of that k sound have? And then lastly, the quote which is highlighted here, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. I want you to think about what's the effect of the contrast between the words survive and lifeless. So pause the video now, write down your answers, and then move on and see how they match up to mine. So the first question, which was how does Shelley use language to create the impression that Ozymandias was unpleasant? We've got like language such as the frown and sneered and mocked. He presents Ozymandias in a negative way. Shelley may have wanted to show that people in authority can corrupt, and maybe that power itself corrupts, maybe inspired by his own political beliefs or family relationships. So again, this can link back to the context that we looked at the beginning of the lesson. The consonants, so the repetition of the k sound, amplifies Ozymandias' harshness, as the sound is quite harsh. So especially in a poem where everything is important and everything has some sort of meaning behind it, repetition of really hard sounds can almost give us the impression of him sort of calling out commands as a pharaoh, and this harsh sound makes us think about how horrible he might have been. In the last one, the contrast between survive and lifeless reminds us that Ozymandias is dead, as is his legacy. And the word lifeless, it sort of gives you the impression of the statue being lifeless and being a sort of pretend image of power, but also that everything that Ozymandias ruled over is now lifeless and unimportant. So this is the last little bit that we're going to look at. So I've got lots of questions for you on this one. Again, I'll talk you through the questions, then you pause it, write your own answers, and then compare them to my answers. So the first one says, what do we associate with pedestal? So the pedestal is like the sort of stone bit that the statue is sat on. Okay, so I want you to think about the word pedestal. You can look it up if you want and see what Google tells you on that, or look it up in a dictionary. So I'm going to move on to the question below. What's the effect of this imperative? So when he says, look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. So an imperative is a sentence that tells someone what to do. So what's the effect of the fact that this is a sentence that tells people what to do? Moving up to the top right now, Ozymandias uses a religious tone in his words. What does this suggest about him? Simple question, I think, there, so hopefully you can answer that. When we look at the word despair, what does that suggest? I want you to think about the phrase "round the decay of that colossal wreck" and what's the significance of this image. So think about the word decay, colossal meaning massive and giant, and the use of the word wreck as well. Because usually you'd use the word wreck about like a shipwreck or something, and we are talking about the wreck of a statue. And then boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. So there's a lot of alliteration in this last line here. So we've got B and B for boundless and bare, lone and level, and sands and stretch. So what's the effect of that? What does that suggest to us? What does that kind of conjure up in our minds? So pause the video now, write down any of your ideas for these questions, maybe leave space so that if I say something different afterwards, you can add that to it. So with the first question, what do we associate with pedestals? Things we associate with power and authority, reminding us that what he did, although he did have power, it has faded. So someone who's on a pedestal, you can also have the phrase to put someone on a pedestal, and that means to sort of worship them and to give them importance. The imperative on look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair suggests that Ozymandias is arrogant, particularly as he's commanding God, because he's saying, look upon my works, ye mighty, so he's talking to God. He thinks that God would look upon what he's done and realize that man has become more powerful than him. when he says, so the word despair, so he's suggesting that God would despair when looking upon the power that he's created. So it does, like I've kind of said this before, but it implies arrogance because he thinks that he's better than God. Another word that's really useful here maybe is hubris, so Hubris, and that is when someone believes that they are sort of all powerful, and I think that's suggested here. Oh, sorry, I've mixed up those two questions as well. So it's the religious imagery sort of suggests that Ozymandias thinks he's better than God, but then that also feeds into the use of the word despair, which further highlights his arrogance. The significance of the image around the decay of that colossal wreck, the image is one of decay and ruin. So decay is something that sort of gives you the image of something rotting away, doesn't it? And so despite his arrogance and despite his power, his empire has crumbled. And the alliteration, so boundless and bare, lone and level, and sounds and stretch, emphasizes the vast emptiness, that there's nothing left. So it repeats, those words repeat, don't they? So boundless and bare, lone and level, sounds and stretch. It gives this idea of sort of emptiness and the fact that there's nothing left there. So you should have a really good set of notes on this poem now. You can go back through and you can just look at it with the sound down and like look at my notes and add to your notes. You can also go to Quizlet, which the link is here, and the link will be in the Show My Homework post as well. And there I've created some flashcards which match up exactly with the questions I've asked you in this lesson, so that you can revise your knowledge and make sure that it sort of sticks in your head. I would recommend going back to those maybe one day after your lesson and then booking some time next week to go back to them again to make sure that you've remembered all the information from this lesson. Hopefully it's useful. You can message me on Show My Homework, or you can message your class teacher. And if you've got any questions at all, we'd be really happy to answer them. Thanks, Year 10. Bye.